Good afternoon. I suppose we'll start. I think we're all here or we're joining. Thank you very much on behalf of the Abasi program in Islamic Studies at Stanford. To our guest, Darryl Li, and to all of you for coming today. As you know, he's the author of an important new book, The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity, which I'm holding before us here. It's a wonderful book. I hope we'll learn a lot today, and I urge you all to read it. Go buy copies from Stanford University Press. The book cover is also a work of art, like its contents. So it'll be wonderful to hear from our speaker today, Professor Li, who comes to us from the University of Chicago. Very sorry, Professor Li, not to be able to host you in person, but thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to share with us your thoughts on this important new book. As many of you know already, he is a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago, where he's also on the law faculty. He is a Harvard PhD and a Yale University Law School graduate. So Darryl, fingers crossed. I know we have a Supreme Court pick coming up. I think you are way overqualified to be the next justice there, given that pedigree. So let me know if you get a phone call the next couple of days, maybe Saturday, hang out by the phone, and we'll see if you're gonna have a next job for life, right? You can look behind all this. So sorry, dark humor to begin the conversation. But thank you, Professor Li, for coming to share your thoughts on this new book. Again, it just appeared this year through Stanford University Press, The Universal Enemy. So for all of us here, Professor Li will offer his thoughts on the book. He will come to a stopping point, and I'll invite us all to submit questions via the chat function, which I will then mediate for us and share with him as we move through it. So as he's speaking, please think of questions. We invite them, we welcome them, and you can begin to compose them or have them ready on hand to submit by chat, and then we will work through them and offer Professor Li an opportunity to respond to your questions. So without further ado, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Abasi program, and the floor is yours, Professor Li.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Bob. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and with everyone at the Abasi Center. Thanks also to Zach Elwithry and Colin Hamill for their fantastic work in putting this together. It's really nice to be back, quote unquote, back at Stanford to talk about this work. This is my first Zoom book talk, so please bear with me for any infelicities or general forms of weirdness. The first test I want to pass is to see if I can get my PowerPoint up. Let's see. All right, is that okay, Bob? Can you see?
All yes, right. Looks great. Looks great. Thank you.
Super. Okay, I'm gonna let's see here, and then I will turn off my camera so you're not distracted. Thanks all again for taking the time to hear about this book. As Bob mentioned, it's called The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. And it's an ethnographic and archival study of transnational jihad fighters with the focus on folks who participated in the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina in ex-Yugoslavia from 1992 to 1995. So for those who may not be aware, the various crises that resulted from the partition and dissolution of the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia really kind of dominated the agenda of the so-called international community in the 1990s. So in many ways, the war of Bosnia was sort of seen as a paradigmatic so-called post-Cold War conflict. And it was also a site of mass atrocity that kind of riveted the attention of audiences in the West, right? So images like the one on the right from the Omarska concentration camp run by Bosnian Serb nationalist forces really sort of galvanized debates around humanitarian intervention and mass atrocity in the West. This was also around the time of sort of 50th anniversary celebrations of the end of World War II, commemorations of the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. And this was also a moment where sort of the United States was looking for new ways of understanding its role in the world and global hegemony, and the prevention of mass atrocities and humanitarian intervention as a way of kind of doing good in the world was one of the more convenient rationales on offer for thinking about kind of American global power at this moment in the 1990s. So that's a pretty standard kind of narrative of, you know, what was going on with this war. And it was, you know, it was enormously, it was sort of, you know, on the headlines of Western media. The United Nations sent its largest ever at the time peacekeeping force, about 40,000 soldiers. And there's a, you know, really voluminous literature sort of about ethnic cleansing, war crimes, genocide, and, you know, sort of ethnic conflict emerging from Bosnia. So this book basically looks at this sort of paradigmatic and pivotal episode in, you know, what we can think of as, you know, sort of humanitarian intervention, ethnic conflict, and so on. But instead of looking at it from the point of view of the local populations or even of the kind of West intervening from above, it sort of takes a viewpoint from a side sort of angle, right, from a third set of actors. And by that, I mean the so-called jihadists or mujahideen. So the Bosnian War was also a cause that aroused enormous interest and sympathy among Muslim sort of majority countries around the world. Because, of course, Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina bore the vast brunt of mass atrocities, ethnic cleansing, genocidal massacres, and such during the war. So Muslims around the world also mobilized to support Bosnia through humanitarian aid, diplomatic support, media, all sorts of things. One of the relatively minor, numerically speaking, but very prominent forms of solidarity that emerged around this time was, of course, the phenomenon of jihad, of individuals traveling from different parts of the world to fight in Bosnia alongside local Muslim populations against Serb and Croat nationalist forces. And the jihad in Bosnia was one of many conflicts around the world from the late 1970s in Afghanistan all the way through to this day, conflicts around the world that involve Muslim populations and that have aroused sort of solidaristic interest, right? So the best known, of course, would be the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, which was amply supported by the United States and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But you also have these other conflicts like in Bosnia and Chechnya, Kashmir, and then, of course, later on with the US invasion of Iraq, all the way through to the emergence of the self-declared Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So part of what I was trying to do with this book was to actually produce an empirically grounded study of what's called transnational jihadism. So I spent most of the past 15 years doing research in one form or another. That included a little bit more than a year of ethnographic fieldwork in Bosnia, as well as interviews and archival work in several other countries. So Pakistan, Egypt, Palestine, Yemen, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United States, UK, Italy, England, a few other places, which was important to track down kind of veterans of the jihad in Bosnia. So a few thousand folks, Muslims from around the world, traveled to Bosnia and fought in the war. And what was particularly, what stood out a little bit about their participation, as opposed to cases like in Afghanistan or Kashmir, is that they fought alongside a local Muslim population, and they also fought alongside a recognized nation state government, right? Recognized by the international community. So that was a bit unusual. And what happened during the war was that these foreign so-called jihadists were mostly consolidated into a special unit that served under the overall command of the army of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and was composed about half of volunteers from around the world and half by Bosnian Muslims. So this unit, which was called Katibat al-Mujahideen in Arabic, or Order al-Mujahideen in Bosnian, as I mentioned, it sort of concentrated these foreign fighters. It chose its own leaders who were all Arabs. It raised its own funds from abroad. And it had its own sort of special educational program that was organized along the kind of Salafi orientation to Islam. But at the same time, they fought under the aegis, under the flag, and under the orders of an avowedly secular, multi-ethnic nation state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they took orders from generals who, in many cases, were not practicing Muslims or not Muslims at all. So here in this slide, up on the upper left, this is the seal of the unit, which has its name in both Arabic and Bosnian, as well as the motto Nashput Jihad in Bosnian, or Sabilin al Jihad in Arabic, our path is jihad. And this map here kind of, was taken from its publicity materials that were distributed in various countries around the world, kind of signaling a kind of, for lack of a better term, like pan-Islamic pageantry, right? Yet at the same time, other forms of their symbolism, such as here in the lower right-hand corner, this is a seal from one of their internal documents. And what's interesting about the seal is that the coat of arms here is a lily, which is basically a nationalist symbol, a Bosnian nationalist symbol. Anyway, so these fighters, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the media discourse and policy discourse on foreign fighters, so-called roving jihadists. These are folks whose combination of transnational mobility and religious commitment in the practice of violence marks them out as particularly sort of, vicious or fanatic type of figure, a fighter who, who doesn't really obey any kind of standard normativity, who's kind of an enemy to ideas of tolerance or multiculturalism. Anyway, that plays into sort of the title of the book and some of the ideas that I'm playing with. I'm going to skip ahead because I know we don't have a ton of time. So one of the things that's interesting about the so-called foreign fighter phenomenon is that much of what's been written kind of assumes the nation state as the basic unit for understanding these things. So, one of the most common questions that you see in a lot of the research is, foreign fighters, what countries are they from? Let's figure out how many of them come from countries A, B, or C, and then kind of figure out what variables correlate with that. And actually this image here on the right, this is just kind of a standard thing. This is a map of foreign fighters going to Syria, and you have, these little arrows indicating kind of national origin of fighters. One of the things that the book kind of gets into and discovers is that thinking about folks engaged in diasporic forms of circulation is actually, I argue, it's much more illuminating in terms of understanding what's going on. And this also helps us move away from kind of a nation state framing. So the gentleman in this photo, and he's also the guy in the photo that we saw earlier here, he's known as Abdulaziz, and he's arguably the most prominent of the Arab mujahideen who were in Bosnia. So he spent a few months in Bosnia at the beginning of the war. He gave a lot of media interviews and was pretty widely resented for being someone who was a self-promoter. So on the left, there's an article from the front page of a Sharq al-Awsat newspaper. And then on the right is an interview that he gave to a Croatian newspaper, right? So this was someone who really kind of was very prominent and kind of spoke about Bosnia as a kind of pan-Islamic cause and urged people to come and fight. And, the first question that the journalists who approached him asked, and these were journalists from the Times of London to Arabic media, local sort of Bosnian Croatian media, their first question was, where are you from? What's your nationality? And so he told them that he's Saudi. And, that kind of struck everyone as making sense, right? Saudi Arabia is a country that claims the sort of mantle of global Islamic leadership. It kind of amalgamates, petrodollar or petrocapitalism and piety in this way that people associate it, with like Wahhabism, Salafism, exporting jihadi ideals and so on. So, that kind of, that's a pretty, consistent narrative. So one of the things that I found in my research that was pretty interesting is that Abu Abdulaziz, yes, he is a Saudi citizen, but he was actually born in the independent princely city-state of Hyderabad in southern India in 1941 or 1940. He is part of a diaspora from the Hadramaut region of southern Yemen, a diaspora that has traversed the Indian Ocean and has branches everywhere from Mombasa to Indonesia and many places in between. And Abu Abdulaziz's family left India in the aftermath of Hyderabad's forcible integration into the Indian Union after decolonization. But he grew up in kind of this, Indian Arab world. So he grew up speaking Arabic, English, and Urdu, and basically had a kind of diasporic life, So his family migrated to the Hejaz and they settled in Jeddah. So that's how he became a Saudi national, because at that time, this was the 1950s, it was more possible for Arabs to get Saudi citizenship. And he spent his career as a clerk in Saudi Airways and traveled the world kind of as an administrator. So part of what the first chapter of the book does is sort of re-narrates his life story as a sort of diasporic biography, right? A trajectory that crosses geographic regions, linguistic zones, and kind of equips him to do a lot of the day-to-day work of what I think of as kind of the universalism of a project like the Bosnian Jihad, right? So for me, what's interesting about transnational jihad movements like the one in Bosnia isn't the fact that they allegedly stand outside of all ideas of human tolerance and multiculturalism and whatever, but the fact that they themselves claim to embody a particular argument about humanity. And they point to their own diversity, their national diversity, racial diversity, and doctrinal diversity as evidence to that ends. Now, it's really important to be clear that this is not an argument about what is actually universal or what isn't, right? It's about the fact that folks in the world make universalist claims and have to develop practical means of actually trying to verify those claims and working them out in practice. And it's especially interesting to work them out in practice in situations of armed conflict, where you have a bunch of folks who are not mobilized by a state, who have come together from many different countries, speaking many different languages, and suddenly find themselves in a war zone together. Anyway, this is Abu Abdulaziz in Jeddah when I caught up with him a few years ago. So this is 2 decades after his involvement in Bosnia. This is his brother on the left, who's he's passed away now, but he's a very prominent family counselor and basically like a sex therapist, gave a lot of advice to couples and so on. And also they both participated in the jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s, interestingly enough. So anyway, that's really the first chapter, is to sort of think about transnational jihad mobilizations in a kind of framework of diasporic mobility. The other chapters in the book also sort of explore the ways that the jihad fighters from different backgrounds kind of worked out and resolved differences over culture and doctrine and so on. One of them is in the question of burial practices. So this is a cemetery that I visited. That's where the main base camp of the jihad fighters was during the war. And there were interesting disputes over styles of burial. So for example, these sort of upright headstones, right, were kind of the standard way of burying folks in Bosnia, according to some interpretations of the Hanafi school of Islamic law. These low, unmarked headstones are associated with the Salafi orientation within Islam. So there are these interesting debates about, how Bosnians who joined the jihad battalion who fell in battle were to be buried, right? And different situations where the families would sometimes want them to be buried one way, the Arabs they had fought with wanted them to be buried another way. Sometimes the headstones would get changed. So for example, this person was originally buried with a headstone like this, but then the family came along later and changed it. The other interesting thing about this particular cemetery was that it was started by the jihad fighters, but then after the war, it just became the regular kind of cemetery for the village that was nearby. So against the image of the foreign fighter as a kind of completely rootless person who shows up in a war zone and has no sense or concern for the local population and is kind of just killing and rampaging and so on, the research here really shows how these folks, definitely engage in problematic practices, elicit a lot of pushback and critique from local populations, but they're also not operating in a vacuum. They do find ways of cultivating ties with at least some parts of the local population, and they find their own ways of, they make their own way in these societies and in these countries. In some cases, dying there and literally kind of, mingling themselves into the soil. So the book really kind of explores the sort of intercultural dimensions of these jihad practices. Another, of course, really important area of this was the question of marriage. So a fair number of the jihad fighters married Bosnian women. So the book explores some of the questions around race and desire and doctrinal sort of disputes. Also the way in which the book is also attentive to thinking about 2 axes of racialization when we're talking about Islam and the war on terror. So one axis is, of course, the racialization of Muslims as a kind of global project, that's particularly personified by the US-led global war on terror. But then at the same time, this racialization of Muslims as such intersects with the racializations that already exist throughout the world, including racial differences and discourses of racial difference among Muslims themselves, right? So Bosnia occupies a particularly interesting case in these debates, right? So there's, discussions both in the West and also in majority Muslim countries like in the Middle East. There's a fascination with Bosnia as a country that is both European and white as well as Muslim, right? A fascination and also a suspicion from both sides, right? So in Western discourses around humanitarian intervention, there was always this concern that Bosnians, they might seem modern and European, but they're secretly, prone to fundamentalism. There was even a little bit of a discourse around the fear of so-called white Al-Qaeda, because if you have Bosnians who join Al-Qaeda, they can get past racial profiling. And then similarly, in the Middle East, there was a fascination with Bosnia because, mashallah, this shows the transracial scope and universality of Islam, but also suspiciousness, sort of this idea that, oh, the Bosnian Muslims, they're too European, right? They don't really, there are questions about the depth of their piety, right? So a lot of these debates kind of get played out in different ways, and the book tracks some of them. And marriage is just one particularly sort of interesting site. So, for example, this gentleman here, Abu Hamza, is from Syria. He fought in the jihad, and he married a woman who's over here, who was the widow of a Bosnian imam who was murdered in the Omarska concentration camp, the one that I showed you in the first slide. So there are 3 children from the first marriage, and then 3 children from their marriage. And I spent a lot of time with these folks and kind of followed them. And they're just a really interesting example of sort of the cultural sort of dynamics at work. And then here's Abu Hamza with his Bosnian in-laws, who actually live in Switzerland. So the first half of the book really tries to spin out this idea of what a universalist project looks like that isn't necessarily Western in its provenance or liberal in its orientation. And that's why it kind of digs into these questions of how difference is kind of mediated and processed. The second half of the book really kind of tries to pull back and to ask the question of, well, what does it mean to think about universalist projects in the plural? Either as in a sort of comparative sense or even as competing or as connected. So the second half is composed of 3 chapters. One is about the socialist non-aligned movement. The second is about United Nations peacekeeping. And the third is about the global war on terror. And in each of those chapters, I try to trace out how the jihad sort of interacted with it or connected with it in different ways. So the chapter on non-alignment really focuses on, so for those who are not aware, Yugoslavia was a very important member of the non-aligned movement, which was a group of states that tried to steer a middle course between the capitalist West and the communist Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. So Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser and India under Jawaharlal Nehru were kind of also major players in the non-aligned movement. So that chapter focuses on Arab students who came to Yugoslavia during the Cold War on scholarships and who were kind of, tokens of non-aligned solidarity and anti-colonial solidarity. But when the war comes and as Yugoslavia comes apart and as socialism begins to be discredited, the racialization of these folks is repolarized. So they become glossed or understood or suspected as, sort of potential jihadis. And it also is the case that a small number of them did actually join the jihad. And it was precisely because they were already in the country that they played a crucial role as interpreters and as mediators. So we have folks who got these scholarships and came to Yugoslavia basically as, young pioneers and vanguards of socialism, who then end up playing this really important facilitative role in kind of a pan-Islamic solidaristic project. The chapter on UN peacekeeping is there in part to make sure that, to make clear that the argument about universalism is not about kind of rehashing an idea of competing civilizations. So this is not really an argument about, Islam versus liberalism. And one of the things that's really helpful for thinking about this is that the book draws attention to the fact that this UN peacekeeping force in Bosnia, which I mentioned was the largest one in the history of the UN at the time, about a third or a quarter of its troops were Muslim. And so this photo is from a monument in the town of Tuzla. And this commemorates the contribution of Pakistani UN peacekeepers during the war in Bosnia. Pakistan was a major contributor, sent 2 battalions of soldiers. And the field work that I've done with these folks really, confirms that for them, participating in the UN mission in Bosnia was both a form of pan-Islamic solidarity, as well as a way for them to demonstrate that they can participate in kind of the, liberal-led international legal order at the same time. So for them, there wasn't really a contradiction between, pan-Islamic solidarity and, international legal norms. And that idea really comes to play in the story of this gentleman, Abdulmanaf Kasmuri. This gentleman was, he's a Sandhurst graduate. He's from Malaysia, Sandhurst graduate, served for several decades in the Malaysian army, actually fought in the jungles against the communist guerrillas there for a number of years in the 1970s and 80s. During the Bosnian conflict, he volunteers to join the UN peacekeeping force in Bosnia, is disillusioned at the UN's inability or unwillingness to, stand up for the Bosnian Muslims. So he quits and he joins the Jihad. He joins the Jihad battalion, and it's precisely because he was trained at Sandhurst that he very quickly plays a very important role in planning a lot of their major military operations. So I caught up with him in Kuala Lumpur a couple of years ago, and we had a long set of conversations about this. And it's very clear that for him, there wasn't some sort of deep contradiction between working for the UN and joining the Jihad. That in both cases he was, trying to support Bosnian Muslims, and talking about sort of ideas of humanity and sort of, shared humanness and so on. And that's a consistent sort of discourse for him that just has different means for it being worked out. Finally, as I mentioned, the last chapter looks at the global war on terror and how these mobilizations, and I should be clear that what we have in the 1980s and 1990s is a whole set of different folks crossing borders and participating in wars in the name of jihad, and only some of them actually see the United States as an enemy. So for the case in Bosnia, there wasn't a particular kind of agenda. This wasn't, Al-Qaeda wasn't even really a thing at that time. And these are folks who are not necessarily pro-US, but there was just a notion that there were different kind of projects going on at the time. But nevertheless, after 9/11, the United States sort of dedicates itself to making sure that all forms of transnational armed Islamist activism are to be shut down, essentially. So that chapter kind of traces a number of veterans of the Bosnian Jihad as they get arrested or kidnapped by the CIA or various national police and intelligence forces, and then shuttled through a global network of prisons and black sites. So Guantanamo is only the most prominent. So for example, the famous Supreme Court case that led to habeas corpus rights for detainees in Guantanamo. That case actually, the named plaintiff in that case was an Algerian who was taken from Bosnia and sent to Guantanamo. And I should mention that I've also been involved in some of this litigation. So the gentleman on the left, Ahmed Zahir, is someone who I helped to represent, who was detained at Guantanamo for a number of years and was the longest running hunger striker there. So the book really focuses on that last chapter on how Bosnia becomes one more site in kind of the global unfolding of the war on terror campaign. And there what happens is that the United States and the European Union pressure Bosnia to set up a border immigration regime, in part as a condition for joining the European Union. And as part of that, they construct the country's first immigration prison. And although the justification is that it's supposed to kind of catch people who are crossing the border and to keep them from going into the EU, what actually happens is the United States essentially forces Bosnia to strip a number of Arabs living in the country of their Bosnian citizenship. So these are Arabs who came to Bosnia either for the jihad or for aid work or to be students. They married Bosnian women, they became Bosnian citizens, but then after 9/11, they're seen as suspicious and threatening. So the United States basically makes the Bosnian government take away their Bosnian citizenship and deport them to their countries of origin, where some are tortured and disappeared. So Abu Hamza, who we saw in the previous photo with his family, is one of the people who spent a lot of time in the immigration prison. And because returning him to Syria raised a number of legal and political problems, he was able to eventually get himself released. And I should be clear that these are folks who were never charged with any criminal offenses. And their deportation was justified on the basis of national security based on secret evidence. So Abu Hamza spent about 7 years in the immigration detention center without charge. And eventually the Bosnians and the US, I guess, sort of just gave up. So now he is at liberty, but he has to, you know, sign in every day to the police station. He can't really work, but he's at least able to sort of stay in the country and be near his family. So anyway, that's really the broad trajectory of the book. It's the way I think of it is that it's sort of an attempt to write a counter history of international politics in the period of American global ascendance from the end of the Cold War up until the current moment, where, you know, American global hegemony is under, you know, forms of contestation that it hasn't seen in a while. But it attempts to tell that story, again, as I mentioned earlier, from this sort of third view, right? Of folks who are transnational, who are engaged in universalist projects, but who are not your typical characters, right? Like UN peacekeepers or US soldiers and so on. And it tries to sort of, you know, it asks the question of, you know, what do we see differently and what do we illuminate by taking such a perspective? Anyway, I think that's about it. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I should probably stop here and we can move to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Li, for that wonderful talk. So we're gathering some questions in the queue. I see Zach and Colin have set up a Q&A button for us, so we have a few coming in. But if I may start as moderator today, Professor Li, with, if I may confine myself to 3 questions, just kind of to start the conversation. And then I know we have a lot of students and others waiting to hear from you. But for many of us who are, you know, writing dissertations or beginning to design them, thinking of new book projects, could you take us back to when you began to conceive this project, right? I mean, the problem of transnational jihadi fighters has tended to take people to Afghanistan, right? Or with another kind of bent toward Iraq or elsewhere, right? So your geography is somewhat unusual and overlooked, right? So it'd be really helpful to kind of walk us through your process, how you came to both the kind of thematic concentration and then its geography, would be my first question. And the second question, which I wanted to ask you, really one of the threads running through the book, which I think is one of its major contributions, which distinguishes it from so much literature on transnational jihadism and terrorism and so on, is really this, your focus on race, your attention to the problem of whiteness and the ways in which different actors come to different understandings of non-whiteness as a kind of problem in relation to this universalist project. So I know you offered a number of valuable insights already today, but if you could perhaps elaborate on that and really help us understand more the context in which you see race being so central to your story. And finally, this is somewhat speculative, perhaps on my part to ask you to do this, but to move out of your geography for a moment and time period, is your framework one that you would find useful in thinking about the Islamic State or other projects, right? Or even move beyond that? I mean, we don't have to limit ourselves to that problem, but, you know, in your teaching, in other interventions, I mean, would you recommend this kind of set of questions as those that could be transported to other scenarios? So I'll pause there. We're gathering questions, but again, the first question, you know, how did you come to Bosnia? How did you come to, you know, for those of us thinking of designing our own projects, what words of advice would you offer? And then if you could say a bit more on race, and then finally, to what extent is your framing of this project a kind of mobile one that we can apply to other times and places? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those great questions. So on the first one, you're absolutely right. I was one of those people. You know, the original intention with my dissertation was to write about the Arabs who fought in Afghanistan in the 1980s and to reconstruct essentially the backstory of Al-Qaeda. I was always skeptical of the way that narratives, both on the right and the left, kind of drew a straight line from the Afghan jihad to 9/11. And it was clear that there were a whole bunch of people in Pakistan, Afghanistan in that time period with all sorts of different agendas. So I spent a few months in Pakistan doing fieldwork, and I learned a lot of things. I gathered a lot of material, but I basically came to the conclusion that the research was too difficult for a number of reasons. One just being that at that time, this was 2006 or so, the level of fear around sort of war on terror and sort of Pakistani state, US state violence and so on was just really, really high. And that doing field work of the kind that I wanted, where I could actually have some sort of prolonged ethnographic engagement with folks, which is not really going to happen. Also, I wasn't sure if I wanted to learn Pashto at that time in my life. So, as I think it's helpful to just acknowledge a lot of these like really practical or pedestrian sort of factors that shape, because I'm a big fan of like demystifying the academic production process. So it was around that time that I, started reading media stories about these former jihad fighters in Bosnia, and Bosnia just seemed like a much easier place to work. The war is over. It's in Europe, the US, it's stable, right? So-called. But also I'd followed the Bosnian War very closely when it was going on, when I was a high school student. It was basically like the first sort of event of sort of political sentience for me, right? So I kind of had some sense of the history and of the debates around it. And I realized that what was initially a decision taking from expediency for research raised all of the core conceptual questions that I was really concerned about in the first place, right? Around universalism, humanitarianism, human rights. Before grad school, I had another career kind of human rights NGO world, right? So I was struggling with a lot of those questions anyway. So anyway, that's sort of how that, that was my process. I don't know if that's helpful for other folks, but
excellent, thank you.
Yeah. So on questions of race, I mean, there's so much to say. And I think this is a really interesting moment where I think people are, for various reasons, and in my opinion, quite belatedly paying attention to some of these questions. As I mentioned earlier, there's this need to like think about race and racialization as something that, that cuts across kind of the category of Muslims and Islam. And there's a lot of exciting work that's sort of coming out around that now. And, I'm not, I think there's a lot more to be done, and I think this is wonderful, and I support it. I think also the debates around racialization of Muslims as such in the war on terror is something that we haven't really through as much as we should. And I think questions around Blackness are also really important here, because sometimes we have questions around like, what's the relationship between literatures? When do we do analogical reasoning versus connective reasoning? But what's one of the things that's been striking to me has been how Muslim and Black have sometimes been counterposed as mutually exclusive categories rather than deeply, deeply overlapping ones. And that's been really apparent to me in the work around Guantanamo. So one of the things that was very frustrating and that moved me from the NGO space to academia was, a deep alienation with kind of the, residual compulsory whiteness of the NGO spaces that I was in. And, a lot of the work on Guantanamo and sort of the anti-war on activism, especially the legal activism that I was part of, was not really attentive to questions of race or empire. And also just often engaging in discourses of American exceptionalism that were deep. I mean, basically there was, one of the major arguments in the 2000s about Guantanamo was bad because it's against American values, or Guantanamo is bad because it's not like our wonderful prisons on the US mainland, which are a model for the whole, it's just like garbage like that, right? So I think, for me, it was just a moment of kind of working through those sorts of debates, but then also thinking about how even that critique of empire needed to reckon with the distinct conceptual and political work of race and of Blackness that can't entirely be subsumed into empire. So I think that's where a lot of the interesting sort of questions are going, at least in my opinion. And then the third question was, about Daesh, right? Yeah, I mean, I think insofar as there will continue to be some kind of scholarly production around contemporary jihad practices, there's a few things that I hope will become more common, or maybe even like a minimal expectation after this book. I mean, one obviously is like, I think we have to have a serious conversation about empirical standards and ethical standards in this work, because I think there's some pretty glaring absences in a lot of what's out there. And there's good reasons for that. It's difficult research, and, you need time and funding and all sorts of things. So I'm not totally, downplaying that. But I think also at the conceptual level, the emphasis on trying to understand the forms of difference and sort of mediation and argument and the internal complexity of these jihad movements is something that I think it would, be helpful to see more of in a lot of this work. With ISIS in particular, what's also really interesting is that it's a governance project as much as it is a solidarity project. In fact, I think it's safe to say it's a governance project more than it's a solidarity project. Even though I've written a book about foreign fighters in Bosnia, I feel like with ISIS, there's almost too much of a focus on the foreign fighters over like the actual Iraqis and Syrians, who I'm pretty sure are running most things. And that is entirely because of the preoccupations of Western governments and about their own citizens and what will happen when they come back. And I think that distorts a little bit kind of what might be happening on the ground. But I do hope that, that the book will be a model for dealing with these issues and really just, have some methodological and ethical commitments, and also, to think about what kinds of conceptual questions we can ask that are outside of the framework of either supporting state agendas or purely just sort of, engaging in a kind of defensive maneuver, right? I think a lot of the work that's come out in the past, since 9/11, especially for very understandable reasons, is really focused on kind of, sort of hashtag not all Muslims kind of thing. And I think there's been a reluctance or an unease in how do we engage these questions around political violence in a way that doesn't reinforce, right, or bolster some of the really insidious kind of right-wing narratives that are out there. And, whether this book is successful at that or not, I'm not sure, and that'll be up to readers to decide. But I think it is important that we try to address these questions, because the standard kinds of refutation and denial and avoidance that we've been doing for the past 20 years, I think are just not cutting it.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, those are all wonderful answers. So let me turn now to, first, you've received a compliment here from Mary Heglin at Santa Clara. She writes, "How brilliant, how wonderful, what an amazing project. Thank you, Professor Li." So that's the compliment for you. And then if I may condense some of the questions, one line of inquiry concerns your use of the term armed and transnational. So Sarah Biavani asks, so what do we do with NATO, right? Is NATO, does it fit that framework? Is it an armed transnational actor with a religious ideology, right? So conceptually, you address it in one of your chapters, but could you elaborate here on the place of NATO in this? And then another person asks about the UN. Should we imagine the United Nations as the kind of facilitator of this project in some sense? So combining, I guess, two international entities within your broader framework of universalisms, what do we do with the UN and with NATO? Oh, sorry. I think you may be muted, Darryl. Sorry. We have your screen.
Hey, sorry about that. So I'm putting this image back up, and I'll explain why in a second. So one of the starting points of the book is, I think, the idea that NATO and the UN are universalist projects is something that, at least for the audiences I'm speaking to, is kind of like an assumed starting point. And it's not that I'm trying to disprove that, it's that I want us to have a broader idea of what universalism is and how we think about it. So kind of, I don't know, for the people asking the questions, I'm not sure where they're situated, but the kinds of interlocutors I have in mind are those who, will talk about like the international community, right, as if it's a thing, right, and in an unproblematic way, like, oh, the international community demands X, the international community condemns Y, when we know that really it's 15 governments, the UN Security Council, right? Now we're so used to that, we've naturalized it, right? So there's this idea that the UN, speaks in the name of the universal, and of course we criticize it all the time, and we say it doesn't live up to its goals, it's failing, it's ineffective, it's blah blah blah, but the fundamental relationship there is not necessarily one that's challenged by those kinds of critiques, right? One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that criticizing a universalist project as somehow inconsistent or incomplete doesn't refute it at all, because all universalist projects are aspirational, right? It's not as if, if you say people are abusing human rights, therefore the human rights project just like folds up its tent and goes home, right? Like they have this sort of, odd, almost non-falsifiable quality to them. So for me, the issue is, I think, it's like UN and NATO are the ones that are commonly associated with these universalist claims. And what does it mean when we see, folks who are not often think of as universalists and actually are seen as opposed to universalism as such, what does it mean when we think of them in that way? So it's kind of a heuristic move. So one of the things that comes out of that is that in the cover of the book, in the upper left-hand corner here, these are NATO F-16s. And this image depicts one of the major battles of the jihad. It was near the end of the war. Here are the Mujahideen, here are the UN peacekeeping forces, here are the Bosnian Serb forces, and then here are angels who are intervening on the side of the jihad. And there's reasons for this story that we can get into later. But what's really interesting is that, most of the books about Bosnia and about, so-called ethnic conflicts around the world, they're about these guys and these guys and these guys, right? They're about the local, and then they're about the right, who like represent kind of, universalism in some way. So what I'm trying to do here is to kind of flip the perspective, right? So NATO's here, they're in the picture, but they're a little bit on the margins, right? And that's not to downplay how powerful they are or how influential they are. That's why the last chapter of the book exists, right? So one of the things I want to be very clear about is that, how do I turn this sharing off? Anyway, oh, here we go. One of the things I want to be very clear about is that not all universalist projects are created equal, right? And one of the things that the book struggles with is to think about this idea of universalism at different scales, right? So yeah, the Mujahideen are, they are a universalist project in some way, but they have nothing like the power of the UN peacekeepers, to say nothing of, the United States, right? And the sort of US-led global war on terror. So anyway, I'm not sure if that answers the questions, but I hope I give some sense of like how the book is trying to connect with these different kinds of institutional formations.
Right, great, thank you. That's wonderful. So we have a question that takes us back to the Bosnian context and asks, if I can distort the language of the question somewhat, I suppose it's asking about the relationship between a particular universalism and a kind of nationalist particularism. And the questioner asks, what do you make of the impact of the kind of discourse of the global war on terror on post-conflict nation building in Bosnia-Herzegovina? That's obviously, it's an ambitious question, right? But how do you see that interplay working out? Again, perhaps moving away from your subject somewhat, but the interplay of the global war on terror on questions of identity in Bosnia.
Yeah, so the second chapter of the book gets into this in a little bit more detail. I think the shortest way I can put it is that the idea of kind of jihadism, global jihadism, and so on is, of course, deeply fraught in Bosnia, as it is in many other parts of the world. But it's a little bit, it plays out in slightly different ways. So Bosnia is, it has a very, very, very slight Muslim majority, like something like 51% of the population. And the vast majority, the majority, I think, of the Bosnian Muslim population would probably consider themselves not practicing. So this idea of like the jihad fighters, Al-Qaeda, and so on, it kind of becomes fodder in nationalist arguments. So Serbs and Croats, of course, Serb and Croat nationalists are eager to point to the Mujahideen and the numerous war crimes that they committed during the conflict as evidence of a fundamentalist threat, and to basically associate the Bosnian Muslims with them, right? And this is where questions of race become interesting, right? So there's this idea that the Arabs are the ones who show that underneath the white skin of a Bosnian Muslim is a kind of like fundamentalist threat, right? And so the solidarity between the Arabs and the Bosnians becomes a way of making those arguments. So for Bosnian Muslims, it's a much more complicated question. There are many, many Bosnian Muslims who I met who completely despise these people. They despise them for pushing a very different interpretation of the religion, despise them for making them look bad in the eyes of the West. Just like, I think there's obviously aspects of like, civilizational discourse and race going on there, right? We're Europeans, they're not. But of course, there's also many who are deeply sympathetic and who are grateful to them for their role in the war. So they're deeply divided. But as a result, one of the interesting things I've noticed is that the so-called international community in Bosnia, has been trying to sort of manage in many ways the political tensions since the end of the war. And there's a huge literature that basically talks about how it's ineffective in doing that and how there's a lot of nationalist paralysis. But taking action in the name of the war on terror is actually one of the few things that you can get the international community and the three major political formations kind of on the same side of, right? So for example, the first domestic war crimes trial in Bosnia was not of a Serb or a Croat or a Bosniak, it was of an Iraqi. In many ways, he was kind of just like an easier target for various sides to agree on. Also because in the politics of the war crimes prosecutions, the vast majority of cases are against Serb and Croat defendants, which makes sense because that's where a lot of the crimes were committed. But because of this discourse of balance and all sides committed atrocities, from the Bosnian Muslim or Bosniak perspective, charging folks for war crimes committed by the Arab Mujahideen is sort of a convenient way of conceding that, you know, yes, crimes were committed on our side, but not really by us. It was really by these other people who came and kind of imposed their agenda on us. The two major war crimes trials of Bosnian generals for crimes committed by the Arab fighters kind of made their way through the UN War Crimes Tribunal, and a lot of these tensions kind of come out in those trials. Great,
fascinating, thank you. And thank you to our attendee who posed that excellent question for us. So Professor Li, I think we're getting toward the end here, but we have a great question that I think takes you into what I understand to be your next project. So this is a nice segue to your next book. So I'll just read directly from the question here. How do Islamist jihadists differ from other irregular soldiers or mercenaries, including those who originate in the US and others throughout history? So a first draft of your next book project.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to resist the premise of the question because I think part of what I want to say is I don't really think of jihadism as a category. I think believers can and will always have all sorts of debates about what counts as jihad and what doesn't. But I think if you're not kind of oriented towards the tradition in that way, really, you know, you just have to take note of the fact that there's a whole bunch of people doing very different things and calling it jihad, right? And that includes both armed and unarmed actions. And even among the different forms of like political violence that we think of as jihad, there's really different projects, right? So, you know, trying to overthrow your government because it's un-Islamic and calling that jihad isn't necessarily usefully put in the same category as traveling to another country to help some Muslims fight some non-Muslims and calling that jihad. You might believe in both, but you don't necessarily. And what ends up happening is when people talk jihadism is that they inevitably are choosing some subset of these activities and kind of by elevating them into a category and having like conferences about them and books under that topic and, you know, endowing programs and such. It's sort of this weird thing where on the one hand, you're allegedly engaging in sort of secular objective social science. Yet on the other hand, you're actually intervening in a debate among believers and, you know, choosing some forms of jihad as like more, you know, jihad than others, right? So there's some interesting books on the topic of Salafi jihadism, and they, you know, they'll have a definition of like what they think of as Salafi jihadism, and then and then there's other folks who they talk about as just Salafis who do jihad, right? Like they don't fit into the doctrinal category that they've created, but they have to like acknowledge their existence, and then you start having questions about the conceptual coherence of that category. But anyway, just to the question itself, I think what's important and distinctive about the folks I'm writing about, and in this sense, they are like the folks who fought in Afghanistan and Kashmir and Chechnya, is that if we're talking about folks who travel from one country to another country to fight alongside other Muslims, and they're not organized by a nation state, what makes them different is that they're pushing against a norm in the international legal order that says that political violence needs to be organized through nation states. You need to belong to some country's government or another. And these folks, by doing that and saying, we don't need anyone, we don't need any government's permission, that makes them distinctive. It doesn't make them unique, right? I think there are non-Islamic examples of this, right? But I think it makes them interesting. And in that sense, you know, different from say like Hamas or Hezbollah, right? Groups that might be so-called non-state actors, but are still more or less operating within a national framework. Now, in practice, there's still going to be overlap. There's still going to be individuals who move back and forth and who believe that both are great. But I do think, kind of conceptually, it's helpful to distinguish those formations.
Great. Thank you. Extremely helpful. So I'm afraid our session typically only runs an hour. So I think we're at the end. And unfortunately, we didn't get to all the questions. But for those of you who did send one, I apologize. It's my fault for not getting to all of them. But I urge you to check out the book, because I think the answers are embedded in the text of The Universal Enemy. So please check it out. It's a 2020 publication by Stanford University Press. And please join me in virtually thanking Professor Li for this wonderful talk and wonderful book. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. It was a real pleasure.